Now the artist carefully cuts the sculpture into sections. The number of pieces varies with the size and complexity of the mask. Now he can finally start producing the mold he'll use to cast the old lady face mask. First, he takes a thin plaster impression of each piece. Then he coats the impression in plaster to make the positive half of the mold. Once it hardens, he applies the plasticine piece to space the depth of the mold cavity. Then he coats that in plaster to create the negative half of the mold. When that hardens, he applies release agent to both mold cavities, pours in hot gelatin, then closes the mold. In a half hour, the gelatin hardens into a flexible replica of that particular piece of the plasticine sculpture. He then implants synthetic hairs to create eyebrows. Now, using surgical glue, he begins to apply the pieces, called prosthetics. He starts with the largest face piece first. It includes the nose, cheeks, neck, and upper lip. He cuts a hole in the chin area so that he can apply the chin piece. Now, the lower lip. He cuts off the excess, then glues the edges of the chin piece to the large face piece. Now for the forehead. Again, he applies glue along the edges to connect it to the rest. To age the eyes, he uses contact lenses. They create a ring around the iris, a typical feature of elderly eyes. Using tweezers, he applies eye bags, again gluing the edges to the rest of the mask. And finally, some wrinkly eyelids. With the mask fully assembled, it's makeup time. Using a toothbrush, the artist sprays it unevenly over the mask, then smudges it with his fingers. This technique creates a realistic look because the human face, aged skin especially, has color variations. Using a very thin brush, he accentuates some wrinkles by creating depth with a darker color. Now, some freckles and age spots. And a gray wig. And finally, just a bit of lip color because lips dull with age. All this takes an experienced makeup artist about a month of work, and such expertise doesn't come cheap. A major transformation like this for stage or screen can cost up to $10,000. Gold is the softest and most malleable metal. It can be pressed extremely thin, crafted into various shapes, even drawn out to form a fine wire, and all without breaking. Gold isn't affected by water or oxygen as many metals are, so it doesn't rust or tarnish either. Most gold comes from lode deposits, also called vein deposits, concentrations of gold and other metals in the cracks of rocks. Lode deposits require hard rock mining, the process of removing gold-bearing rock, called ore, by drilling and blasting. Miners descend more than half a kilometer underground. There, they drill holes for explosives using what's called a long-hole air drill. They drill in a specific pattern set out in a plan prepared by the mine's engineers. The engineers know exactly where those veins of gold are, thanks to the mining company's geologists who've studied ore samples. The company collects these samples by drilling deep into the rock at 15-meter intervals. These diamond drill cores, as they're called, are up to 100 meters long and measure 3.5 centimeters in diameter. Gold in its natural state isn't pure. It's usually intertwined with silver and other metals. So the mined ore has to be processed afterward to isolate and extract the gold. A metric ton of ore yields only about 6.5 grams of gold. After blasting the rock apart with explosives, miners use what's called a muck machine to transfer the ore to cars headed to the main shaft and then above ground to the mill. There, a crusher reduces the large chunks into smaller rocks about the size of road gravel. A mill then pulverizes them to the texture of beach sand. The factory adds a water and cyanide solution, then another mill grinds it further into a mud-like pulp. The pulp flows into large settling tanks. The wet solids, being heavier, sink to the bottom. The water at the top drains to another area. They transfer the wet solids to an agitation tank and blow in air. The oxygen sets off a chemical reaction between the cyanide and the gold trapped in the ore, triggering the gold to dissolve and leach into the surrounding water. Drum filters then separate the water from the solids. This water now joins the water that was separated earlier. They pour in zinc powder to solidify the dissolved gold and form pieces containing both zinc and gold. To smelt it into bars, they first have to mix several chemicals: manganese dioxide, fluorite, silica flour, borax, and sodium nitrate. This chemical mix, called flux, will separate the gold from the impurities. They pour it into the smelter, whose temperature is a fiery 1600 degrees Celsius. They rotate the smelter so that the contents heat evenly. Over 2.5 hours, the heavier gold eventually sinks to the bottom, while the impurities, called slag, float to the surface. They pour out the slag, taking a sample to make sure it contains no gold. If it does, it goes back in until it's gold-free.